Well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I know that we'll have some people who are joining us late. I got some emails and texts already with people with some issues, and I just guess that's to be expected when you have this many people and we're living in a virtual world. Some of this will be a little bit of review, but not a whole lot of review. There are a few people who couldn't be here the first week, but who had signed up. So this will be a review for some and a couple of little things I'm adding as well. Each week's going to begin with the plenary session that I'll lead, and I sort of jokingly call it drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot of stuff, but then we have a good 45 minutes to an hour to discuss it. And during the plenary, you'll be muted since we have so many online, but you can use the chat feature for communicating with others or communicating with the tech support. And I know that that was helpful last week. Also, the Zoom link, some of you were trying to find that. It is unique to you, so we can't just give you one. You have to use the one that was issued, and it'll be the same every week. So if you can hang on to the one you used, you'll be good. And as we noted before, the rest of the time happens in small groups that have been pre-assigned. But last week we had some groups who didn't have everybody show up. So they were small and we combined them. So we rearranged some of that, and we have to do it on the spot because we don't know ahead of time. So it's possible you could end up in a different group, but we're trying very hard to make this work and accommodate everybody's wishes. And the group time does end at 8:30, but we're going to give you a 5-minute warning so that you can wrap things up. We got some feedback on that, and hopefully that'll be of some help. So this is kind of an old trope or joke or whatever you want to call it, but David Foster Wallace in his commencement address at Kenyon College used it. And I'm going to come back to David Foster Wallace here in a little bit. But it's the old line about the wise old fish passes two young fish in the water and just swims on by and says, "How's the water, fellas?" And after the fish leaves, the other two look at each other and go, "What's water?" And, you know, it's a silly little thing to just say that fish aren't aware of the water any more than we're really aware of the air. And the point in this case would be as a kind of parable for we're living life. So if someone's, you know, were to ask us, how's it going? We have these little kind of trope answers, but to think about examining the air we breathe or the water we live in, or in our case, the life that we live is what we're really trying to do. So you may remember the quote from Socrates, "An unexamined life is not worth living." I'd probably modify that to say an examined life is perhaps more fulfilling. But again, just a brief reminder that there are two courses at Yale, and we're really modeling this more after the second one there, A Life Worth Living, that comes out of the humanities, and Miroslav Volf helped to pilot that, and our own Phil Love was a part of that as well. And ours is very different from the one at Yale. It's for people at different stages of life, and I think that makes for a much richer conversation. It's not for people with just one particular religious perspective, but I do think it's important to realize if you come from a religious perspective, whatever that is, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, Protestant or Catholic, you know, Orthodox, whatever it is, you certainly should feel free to speak from that perspective, but that's not where the course is grounded. We really focus on different worldviews, different ways of being in the world, and we're trying to see if we can articulate one that is really ours. And so we draw on a lot of different folks from different perspectives, whether it's from philosophy or ethics, culture critics, etc. And then, as I mentioned, all perspectives are welcomed and honored. And we're wrestling with two questions in particular, not little questions. What do you think makes for a life worth living? And how do you decide on an answer? And so that's what we're wrestling with. It's not the same as the life is good at the beach kind of thing, although there are other terms that people use in the literature, like the good life or the flourishing life. Some people use that to translate the word that Aristotle used, a full life, living with purpose, even the joyful life. But it's just definitely not the same as some of the cultural messages that often come our way in social media, TV, etc. And we got started last week with an introduction, but now we're in this kind of next 3 weeks of self and others, pain and pleasure, work and leisure. And then I don't have it on here, but week 5 will be more of a summary and a group reflection process. So we're going to just jump right in and get started. I named this one based on the quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and self and others, but I call it the center of your universe. And the quote is, the relentless first person singular, the I, falls silent and we become aware that we are not the center of the universe. So one of the things we're trying to figure out here, of course, is, well, if we're not the center of our universe, what is? Or if we are, what does it mean to perhaps tend to some of the planets in the outer parts of our system? And we dove in this week to some reading that's probably a little different from what we read in David Brooks. You may have figured that out pretty quick, but I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit. And of course, in your groups, you can talk about this, but I've got a few slides just to kind of hit some of what I thought were some highlights, but feel free to talk about other things. In May's Contrast, I love how he starts. He does this, by the way, in one of his other books. He must be an avid subway rider in New York City. But in his contrast of riding subways in Copenhagen and New York City, he says he wants to avoid romanticizing for 2 reasons. One, he says it's not romantic. There's nothing romantic about riding the subway, even in Copenhagen. But he says it would betray his very point, because the former, Copenhagen, is a big impersonal city just like Manhattan is. But the difference is it is one that somehow is more aware of the other, letting those people on and off the train before they rush in. So question then is, do you think of the city where you live as aware of the other or not? And to what degree? I mean, could you rank it? And what about where you grew up? If you grew up in a larger or smaller place compared to where you live now, how would you rank the city in its awareness of the other? And then, as the title of his book implies, he's really interested in a level he calls decency, which is somewhere beneath this kind of altruistic philanthropist. So picture Bill Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates, right? But it's somewhere above mediocrity. So it's basically a good person. So the question then is, how would you describe such a lifestyle of decency? I mean, that's a very subjective thing, but how would you rate yourself on his scale from mediocrity to altruist? Another one piece that is probably the headier part, he names 3 types of ethics. And you can get lost in the details, but here's the basics. The first one, consequentialism, also goes by the name teleological. And that's a word you would kind of know. You know the word telephone? Well, tel in Greek means distant or far away. So a telephone lets your voice, your phonos, be heard far away. Well, far away ethics would be that which focuses on the ends, the result of what your behavior is doing. Whereas the deontological is more about the intentions or the means, that what you're supposed to do. So think about the example he gives of the woman, she wants to break up with this boyfriend of hers. Is it about the end result, or is it about the damage that'll be done, the hurt feelings? What's the right thing to do? And then the third one, which some people position as somewhere in between, kind of straddling, is the virtue one. And that's where you focus on your moral status. In other words, how you should live. So you try to acquire these virtues. You try to grow in your own personal life. And you don't say up front, well, it's all about consequentialism or it's all about deontological. It might be more about trying to weigh the virtues of the moment. And May points to, in each case, strengths and weaknesses of all three. But he notes that no one ethic, none of those is sufficient. So what do you make of the three approaches? And probably the easiest way to do that is to just use his example. But does one of them resonate with you more than the other? And does one of them seem more problematic? And these questions will be in the sheet that you have. And then I think probably, I think groups could spend the entire time on this one exercise. It's a very famous exercise by Peter Singer called The Child in the Fountain. And there's lots of versions of it, but it goes something like this. You're on the way to work to a new job. And this is one of the versions that he tells. And you're wearing new clothes for your new job. It's your first day, and you come across this toddler who is drowning in a fountain. Well, this is a no-brainer. You're obligated to save the child. But then, of course, the question becomes, if you're obligated to do that for the child you came across, what about the children you don't come across who are perhaps drowning in another way through poverty or hunger, and perhaps even on the other side of the world? So one of the questions then is really a fascinating one is what is your response to Singer's Child in the Fountain exercise? Because remember, he says you're obligated to do the most that you can, well, within reason. So where do you draw that line? And that's the notion that we're responsible to care for others, not just in space, which, like the other side of the world, but even time. Like, what does it mean to be obligated to care for the earth so that our children and their children can have a place? What are our moral obligations toward others, even if we never see them? So right there, just from these few pages in May, there is plenty of material. But I want to share a little bit of other stuff that'll kind of give us a smorgasbord to choose from. Going back to the Aristotle reference, he talks about developing these virtues. Well, of course, Aristotle's Greek, so this word virtue in Greek, arete, it refers to excellence or goodness, which everybody would say, well, sure, yeah, that's what virtue means. But here's the key. It's of a functional sort. So the arete, the virtue of a knife, is to cut well. If a knife doesn't, if it doesn't cut well, it's not a virtuous knife. Virtue of an eye is to see well. So then the question becomes, well, what's the virtue of a person? What is a person supposed to do well to be virtuous? What are people intended to do? How are we intended to live? We know what a knife does. We know what an eye does. What does a person do? How do you define that? There's also a really interesting thing that cultural psychologist Richard Schwader names. He calls it 3 kinds of ethic found in various cultures. And his work was mainly in India, but he calls them autonomy, community, and divinity. So in autonomy, individuals pursue their own goals. Makes sense. Community, they preserve the integrity of the group. Divinity is protecting the divine within each person. So autonomy, of course, would be self. Community would be the larger group. Divinity would be the individual that's around us. The latter two, of course, would be outside of us as opposed to self. But researchers building on his work in India, and lots of people have built on his work, they found varying degrees of these ethics within different cultures. But not surprising, the US, not necessarily unique, but we're pretty darn good at this. We lean toward autonomy. And there's even some interesting work about how in our country's development from the East to the West, the autonomy increased the further west you went. Whether or not that would be true now would be debatable with all the mobility. But, why do you suppose the dominant ethic in the US is autonomy over attention to others? And again, these kinds of questions and a reminder will be in the materials that you'll look through. I told you we're drinking through a fire hose here. So I mentioned this briefly last week, but the book that we read from last week was Brooks's The Second Mountain. And he makes the distinction between that work and his earlier book, The Road to Character. And in that one, I mentioned briefly, he talked about the difference between resume and eulogy virtues. The resume would be about career and self, but a eulogy virtue would be about building a life so that you would not necessarily be motivated by this, but at least would be a way of thinking about it is, what would you want people to say about you when you were gone? That, you know, she really ran meetings well, or that she cared for others, or what would it be? And I couldn't help it when I thought about this. I remembered an old line that Groucho Marx, on his 70th birthday, he was asked how he wanted to be thought of 100 years later. And he said, as a man in remarkably good shape for his age. Probably not going to happen, but it does raise an interesting question. What would you want your legacy, your eulogy to be? And you have to think there about a kind of honest reflection. Now, this is an interesting slide. There's a UK game show. It's called Golden Balls. I don't know if it's still on, but it's based on a sociological experiment that's pretty well known in some different literature called Prisoner's Dilemma. People in law enforcement, people in the military with prisoners, they use this. The basic idea in that case is that if you have two people you've brought in, if you separate them and interrogate them, there's a good chance one of them or both are going to squeal on the other. Well, the UK producers came up with a game show based on this, and it's pretty simple. The guy standing up, he's the MC. Two contestants are seated there, and throughout the show, they've earned some money. So we'll say 10,000 pounds. At the end, they have these kind of secret containers they can put a ball into that has a word on it. If they both put split, they're going to split the money. If one chooses split and the other steal, sharing person gets nothing and the stealer gets it all. If both choose steal, they walk away with nothing. Now, the reason I put this particular picture on is this is considered one of the most famous episodes of the show. The guy on the right, the guy on the left, they're negotiating. They get to negotiate. So before they put their ballot in secretly, they say, well, I'm gonna share it with you. I'll split. And of course, everybody that's ever been on the show says that. But, you know, like there was this one episode where a young girl said to the guy, I'll share it with you. I'll split it. He says, you promise? Oh yeah, I promise. And then of course she put steal and walked away with all the money and he got nothing. Well, this guy on the right, he let the guy on the left go first. And the guy on the left said, well, I'm going to split it. And the guy on the right said, I'm going to steal it. And he goes, you're going to what? He goes, I'm going to steal it. He says, but you got to trust me. When I get it all, I'll share it with you afterwards. And the guy on the left is flummoxed. The whole audience is flummoxed. The MC is flummoxed. Everybody's never seen this. And it goes on and on. You can watch it on YouTube. And finally, they put their secret ballot ball in there and reveal, and both had put split. Well, but here's the punchline. Sociologists have determined that the key to the game is repetition. If you played this game over and over and over again, there would be a level of trust built. And I think that's an interesting question for us when we think about self and others, because one of the factors at work in our relationship with others, especially when we think about the other as someone at some distance, is trust. We briefly mentioned this last week, the Pew study, open-ended, closed-ended questions, Americans just a few years ago. What makes life meaningful? Overwhelming, family, 70%. Friendships was on the list as well. David Brooks wrote an article for the Times. He said, if you ask philosophers how people fill their lives with meaning, they usually point to some version of serving a cause larger than self. Americans, however, indicated family and friendships as giving the most meaning. Only 7% of Americans said meaning is found in helping others. So Brooks wrote, the meaning of meaning seems to have changed, which I thought was just a powerful line. So I'm wondering, how is it that helping others no longer seems to hold the same value it once did? Or do you disagree? Do you think it does, but maybe there's some factor that we're not taking into account? And then the last thing, and then we'll go to groups and you can start trying to make your way through all of this. I mentioned David Foster Wallace's commencement address at Kenyon. It's really a famous piece. You can listen to it online. You can read it if you prefer. And it's called This is Water. Think about it with regard to those fish, right? So everything, this is kind of, I don't know how to describe where it is exactly in the thing, maybe a third of the way in. Everything in my own immediate experience supports my deep belief that I am the absolute center of the universe. The world as you experience it is there in front of you or behind you, to the left or right of you, on your TV or your monitor, and so on. Other people's thoughts and feelings have to be communicated to you somehow, but your own are so immediate, urgent, and real. Now, remember, he's talking to seniors graduating from Kenyon College. And then he says this. This is one example of the total wrongness of something I tend to be automatically sure of. Because the real value of a liberal arts education is to keep you from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely imperial alone day in and day out. So what David Foster Wallace says is, this is the water that we swim in, this kind of isolationist in my head. What does it mean to get out of one's self, out of one's own head? Well, if you don't have enough to wrestle with, that should do it. But you do get to share, again, your name when you get to your group, along with 3 questions: soup or salad, call or text, sneakers or sandals. So that'll be a good way to get you going. And as I said last week, and I want to reiterate this to group leaders and everybody, it doesn't have to be in this order, but there are quotes for the week. You might want to start with that. It tends to generate a lot of conversation because it's pretty easy to pick one. You can, of course, wrestle with the big questions that we've kind of isolated for this week. Is a life worth living primarily defined by what you want for yourself? I think this one's really interesting. What's the difference between self-care and being preoccupied with self? What if my caring for others is due to my low self-esteem needing to be needed? Which is a really tricky one. How does your social location affect your views on self and others? And I think maybe the pandemic is probably as applicable as any of these categories, but when you think about self and others, how has it affected your thinking on these things? And then, as I've said before, we'll always end with it's something to think about. So this is a quote from Kabir. Look what happens to the scale when love holds it. It stops working. So we're going to go to groups, and hopefully if you have any tech issues, you can text Matt about that, but hopefully it'll all work, and we'll see you on the other side with your groups. Hope it goes well. Something to think about.